Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Introduction to Research Methods lectures. Today, ethical guidelines play a significant role in our research process, but it wasn't always that way. Part of the emphasis on ethics in today's world comes from our recognition of our extreme mistakes in the past. In this lecture, I want to talk about some of the major unethical research studies that have driven us to develop research ethics. Unethical medical research studies have been a major driving force towards our modern protections for human subjects. So here are some of the research studies that I want to highlight in this lecture. This list is by no means comprehensive, and it does not recognize many of the other ethical concerns that we see in historical research. But each of these studies has been an important factor in developing modern research ethics for social scientists. So I want to share a bit about each study with you. One of the most notorious unethical research examples is the Nazi research that was done at the World War II concentration camps. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that Nazi experiments served three major purposes. First, they were designed to assist with the war efforts by identifying ways to increase the survival rate of Axis military personnel. Low-pressure chamber experiments were used to identify max survival height for parachuting soldiers. Freezing experiments were used to identify possible hypothermia treatments, and seawater experiments sought ways to make seawater potable. All of the experiments were conducted on unwilling concentration camp prisoners, and they often ended with physical harm and oftentimes even death for the prisoner. The photograph on this slide shows the results of a high-altitude experiment. The second way experiments were used was to develop pharmaceuticals and disease treatments. Prisoners were purposely exposed to contagious diseases like malaria, typhus, tuberculosis, etc., in order to use them as test subjects for immunization compounds. Prisoners were also subjected to bone grafting experiments and mustard gas exposure for similar reasons. Finally, experiments were used to advance the racial ideology of the Nazi regime. One of the infamous experimenters was Joseph Mengele, who conducted twin experiments at Auschwitz in order to trace the origin of genetic disease and other genetic situations like eye color. His gruesome experiments earned him the moniker the Angel of Death, and his wanted poster is shown here on this slide. Following World War II, the experiments conducted on Nazi prisoners were a significant focus of the Nuremberg trials. You've probably heard of the Nuremberg trials before, and these were criminal courts that were overseen by major world powers at the time, and they were designed to hold members of the Nazi Party responsible for war crimes that had been committed during the war. Although not officially part of the Nuremberg trials, the so-called doctor's trial was held at the same time. The doctor's trial was a criminal trial against 23 German physicians and medical administrators, and it was overseen by the American Military Tribunal. The focus of the doctor's trial was on the euthanasia programs and the concentration camp experiments that were conducted on Nazi prisoners. In August of 1946, 16 of the doctors were found guilty by the court, and 7 were sentenced to death and executed the following year. One of the defenses given by some of the doctors on trial was that their experiments were no different than those conducted before the war by non-German scientists. The doctors argued that there was no international law on human experimentation, including no specific guidelines on what separates legal from illegal human experiments. Concerned with the accuracy of that argument, 2 American doctors developed a series of guidelines outlining what constituted legitimate medical research. The final list of guidelines was published in the trial decision of the doctor's trial, and it became what we know now as the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code established 10 points of guidance for researchers who were involved in research on living people. Now, the Nuremberg Code was not a law, it was not an enforceable statute. Additionally, it left oversight of human research to the people running the experiment, which is a problematic stance because the experimenters may purposely ignore the ethical dilemmas, or they may simply be unaware of the ethical concerns while they're running the experiment. Nevertheless, it was one of the first formalized documents outlining ethical principles of human subject research. Most students are familiar with the Nuremberg trials in some sense, if not the medical code itself. But few have heard about the unethical medical research that was conducted here on U.S. soil. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a movement spearheaded by Booker T. Washington that aimed to provide better education and vocational opportunities to Black workers, particularly low-income Black families in the southern United States. Washington opened the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, in furtherance of that goal. In the 1920s, recognizing the unusually high rate of syphilis in the Tuskegee area, which was, they say, about as much as 35% of the adult population of reproducible age was infected. The Tuskegee Institute worked with the United States government to provide treatment for those infected. Now, this treatment consisted of mercury and bismuth, along with other remedies like exercising vigorously. Things that we know now didn't have a significant impact on the disease. Back then, however, that was considered the best remedy for syphilitic patients. Unfortunately, the syphilis treatment program quickly morphed into something that would go down in United States history as one of the worst medical experiments on our soil. After Wall Street crashed and our country struggled in the depths of the Great Depression, funding for national health programs was hard to find. And as you can imagine, funding health programs for lower-income Black families in southern United States was not very high on the priority list. So the Tuskegee Syphilis Treatment Program was abandoned at first. But within a year, the program was reborn as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The problem was that the syphilis study was not about treatment. In fact, it was the opposite. It was the study of untreated syphilis in the Black male. Europe had already published a study on untreated syphilis in the white male. So with the presumed difference in racial groups, doctors wanted to see how Black males compared to their white counterparts. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study recruited 600 men from the original program, 399 of them with syphilis and 201 without as a control group. These men were informed that they would receive the same benefits of the original program, including regular treatments, access to free medical care, and burial stipends. But remember, this was a study of untreated syphilis, so the men were not actually being given treatments. Instead, the men were given placebo medications, and they were given diagnostic procedures that were disguised as treatments. For example, here on this slide is an image of a subject receiving a lumbar puncture, which is an extremely painful medical procedure that's used to test spinal fluid for diseases including syphilis. The subject was told that he was receiving back shots, and they were supposed to help him get better, even though the procedure is actually solely for diagnostic purposes to study how the disease is spreading. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was unethical from the very beginning because the subjects were being lied to about what was actually happening to them. But these ethical violations were made even more serious in 1947 with the development of penicillin. Penicillin became the drug of choice for syphilis treatment, and it had a very high cure rate. The doctors of the Tuskegee Project were concerned that they wouldn't be able to study the progression of the disease if the participants received actual treatment. So the study was continued without treatment and without notification. In fact, study participants were actually barred from military service and from other hospitals, and they had warnings sent out to nearby physicians in the area telling them, please refer all of your patients back to the Tuskegee Institute for any medical help. Since the participants were never informed about the development of a cure, they were also never given the opportunity to quit the study and get treatment on their own. When students learn about this study, most of them assume this was done in a secretive manner because the ethical violations seem to be so outrageously apparent. But this wasn't a secret study at all. In fact, people in both medical and legislative positions were aware of its methods the entire time. The study received continued support from the medical and the scientific community. And in fact, Congress actually had to review the study every 10 years to provide approval for continued funding. In 1969, right before it was shut down, the CDC and the American Medical Society both affirmed the need for the study, and it continued on as usual. Now, it wasn't until 1972 when the research study is exposed to the public and the study is finally shut down. A whistleblower had serious concerns about the ethics of the study, and he tried discussing his concerns with superiors up the chain of command. He was completely ignored, so he ended up giving his story to Gene Heller at the Associated Press, who broke the story in the Washington Star on July 25, 1972. Members of the public immediately compared Tuskegee to the Nazi experiments in World War II, even as the Public Health Service maintained the subjects were volunteers and they were happy to see the doctors. After the study was publicized, Congress initiated an advisory panel to review the study procedures. Not surprisingly, the panel found that the Tuskegee study was ethically unjustified, and that the knowledge that we gained from letting the disease continue untreated did not outweigh the risk that the study posed for its subjects. Within the month, the Tuskegee syphilis study was officially shut down. By the time the study was shut down, 28 of the original participants had died directly from syphilis, and 100 were dead from syphilis-related complications. 40 wives had been infected by their continually contagious husbands, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis because of the infections of their parents. The following year, Congress held hearings about the study, and a class action lawsuit was filed. A $10 million settlement and lifetime free medical benefits were given to the participants and their families. It wasn't until 1997, though, when President Bill Clinton finally offered a public apology for the Tuskegee experiment, and he established the Tuskegee University National Center for Bioethic Research and Healthcare. As a direct result of the Tuskegee syphilis study, the National Commission of the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research was created. It's a mouthful, but it's important. This commission held a series of conferences over 4 years to discuss medical research, with the goal of creating a bioethics policy for the entire United States. At the end of their deliberations, the commission released what is known as the Belmont Report. And this contains the commission's summary of the basic ethical principles that should be involved in human subject research. Like the Nuremberg Code, these guidelines are not required by statute, but they were the first step in codifying research ethic protections into United States law. The Belmont Report states that there are 3 basic ethical principles for any research that involves human subjects. Respect for persons meant that research should protect the autonomy of all people and treat them with courtesy and respect. This guideline calls for researchers to provide subjects with truthful and comprehensive information about the research study, and to allow them to determine their participation themselves. Embedded within this respect for persons was the recognition that not all people have the same ability to be autonomous agents. And the Belmont Report stated that respect for the immature and the incapacitated may require additional protections, even to the point of excluding them from participating. The second principle of the Belmont Report was beneficence, which is the philosophy of do no harm. The Belmont Report added that when harm is possible, as it is with most research, then the researcher must ensure that the benefits to the subject and the research overall are maximized, and the risks to the subject are minimized. The most common depiction of beneficence is a scale, with risks on one side and benefits on the other. At the worst, they should be equalized, but whenever possible, the risks should be lower than the benefits. If the risks are higher than the benefits, then the research would violate this principle. Finally, the Belmont Report argued for justice, and this principle is about fairness. Who gains the benefits of the research? Who bears the risk for the research? The principle of justice ensures that the experimental procedures are administered fairly, so as to fairly distribute both the costs and the benefits to all potential research participants. The Belmont Report text reminds readers of the high costs paid by concentration camp prisoners and Tuskegee studies participants, even though both research studies benefited those outside of the populations that were used during the experiment. Physical harm to participants is a serious concern, but it's not the only reason that studies can be unethical. 2 of the studies discussed in your textbook deal with psychological harm to the participants. The Milgram obedience study featured participants who thought they were shocking other study participants with serious electrical shocks. The reactions recorded in the original study show the extreme emotional distress that these subjects were under, trying to comply with the researchers' demands, but also believing themselves to be hurting another human being. Even though the Milgram study did not involve actual shocks or physical trauma, the participants did experience mental trauma as a result of this experience. Another psychological harm related to Milgram's obedience study has to do with the participants' self-image. We all believe ourselves to be good, decent human beings, and research studies that disprove our self-image can be traumatizing to us. The Milgram study, for example, was designed to explain the behavior of Nazi prison guards, who argued that they were simply following orders during the atrocities that occurred at the concentration camps. The results of the Milgram experiment showed that most people would continue harming a research participant when told by a person in power, even if they didn't actually want to hurt the person. Imagine at the end of this study being one of those people that went all the way to the XXX, which was the highest shock they did, and then realizing after the study is published that you followed the same line of thinking as a Nazi guard. You hurt someone simply because a person in power told you. Imagine what that does to your self-image. Now, the Stanford prison experiment also featured psychological trauma. One of the participants actually broke down during the study and had to be removed before the end of the third day. On here is a photograph of another participant, prisoner 819, who was also released before the study ended. This photograph shows the participant breaking down, having an emotional moment, while the other prisoner participants chant, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner," repeatedly in the other room. The final Stanford prison experiment ended in 6 days, which was much earlier than the expected 2-week duration, because of the concerns for the mental well-being and the physical safety of participants. Well, that completes our discussion of unethical historical research. Join me in the next lecture as I describe the ethical guidelines that are used by contemporary social science researchers.